Lizard Wind ripped the reins from Amos's frozen hand and put them into Sitala's instead, the day he changed her life by giving away his last horse, though the fool who did it did not yet understand that she and her 2 children were about to change his right back. The whole of Iron Creek would call it the worst decision a ruined man ever made in a New Mexico winter. Amos Colter, down to his final animal and the coat on his back, pressed the reins of that one remaining horse into the frost-cracked hands of a starving Apache widow. In the teeth of a storm that was killing men who still had money and food to spare. He did not know yet about the vagrancy order already being drafted in a warm office 40 miles east, or the agent who would soon decide that a widow bold enough to take a white rancher's horse was a widow worth making an example of. He knew only the cold and 2 small faces peering from under a thin blanket behind her, and the plain fact that he could still walk home on his own 2 legs, and she could not. Stories like this deserve more than a quick watch tap. Join beside the channel name and become a member. Now, let's go back to the morning. A blizzard nearly finished a family before it ever got the chance to become one. This is the story of Sitala and Amos, and of a horse that was never really about a horse at all. Amos Colter was 31 years old that winter, and by any measure that mattered in Iron Creek he was already a failed man. 3 dry summers had burned his grass down to red dust. A banknote in Silas Pruitt's name sat against every acre his father had homesteaded, and the herd that had once numbered near 400 head had shrunk, animal by animal, sale by sale, funeral by funeral, to a single gelding named Duke standing in a lean-to that leaked more than it sheltered. His father was 2 years dead. His mother had followed within the year. Some blamed grief more than the influenza that carried her off. Amos worked the ranch alone because there was no one left to work it with him, and because Iron Creek had already decided, in the quiet, cruel way small towns decide things, that Amos Colter was a man circling a drain nobody expected him to climb out of. He rode into town that morning for one reason only: to beg Pruitt's bank clerk for 30 more days on the note before the blizzard buried the road entirely, already knowing, with the flat certainty of a man who has begged before, exactly what the answer would be. His father, old Ezra Colter, had built the place out of nothing but stubbornness and a good eye for grass. And Amos still remembered him saying, more than once across a supper table that no longer existed in any form Amos recognized, that a man's worth in this country was measured by what he was willing to give up for another soul, rather than by what he managed to keep for himself. Amos had not thought much of that lesson as a boy, too busy chasing calves and resenting chores to weigh his own father's philosophy, but it had come back to him steadily through 3 ruinous years, in the particular way a father's voice tends to surface exactly when a son needs it least convenient to hear. He had buried both his parents within 18 months of each other in the little cemetery behind the church that would not open its doors to Sitala, and some nights the ranch felt less like an inheritance than a debt owed to 2 people who could no longer collect on it. He had convinced himself riding into town that morning that today would be an ordinary defeat. Another 30 days denied, another slow turn of the same wheel that had been grinding him down since the second dry summer. He had no way of knowing that by nightfall he would have discovered exactly what his father meant and paid for the lesson with the only asset he had left to spend. Sitala had been walking since before dawn, and by the time Iron Creek's church steeple showed gray through the falling snow, she had stopped believing her feet still belonged to her. She was 24, Chiricahua Apache, and a widow of 11 months. Her husband Kewin had drowned the autumn before trying to pull the band's horses out of a flash flood in the canyon. Their families had watered stock in since before any white man had drawn a line on a map calling it his. It was good water in a dry country, that canyon, and Silas Pruitt had wanted it for 2 years before Kewin died, and had wanted it considerably more urgently since. With her husband gone and the small remaining band scattered by winter hardship and by an agent who had been quietly starving them off their rations for months, Sitala had walked the last 9 miles into Iron Creek, carrying her son on her hip and leading her daughter by a hand gone numb inside a thin deerskin mitten, because staying in the canyon 1 more week without food would have killed all 3 of them slower, but just as surely as the blizzard now threatened to do it fast. She could still see, if she let herself, the exact color of the water the morning Kaywin went into it, not the churning brown flood itself, but the strange, almost gentle gray of the sky above it. Because some part of her mind had apparently decided that watching the sky was easier than watching her husband disappear beneath a wall of runoff, trying to cut a rope free from a panicked horse. He had gotten 3 of the 4 animals to the bank. He had gone back for the 4th because it belonged to the oldest woman left in their small camp, a mare that was more pet than pack animal, and he had not come up again where anyone could reach him. Sitala had pulled his body from a gravel bar a half-mile downstream herself, alone, because the 2 men left in camp that week were both too old to wade that current, and she had not cried then either, not with Taya 5 years old and watching from the bank and needing, more than her mother's grief. What remained of the band had scattered through that winter and the one after it, some south toward San Carlos, where at least the ration house still opened its doors some weeks, some simply gone in the way people go when there is no longer a strong man's name to hold the camp together. Sitala had stayed by the canyon as long as she could make it feed 3 mouths, because leaving it, she understood even then, was the first step toward losing Kaywin's claim on it entirely, a fact Silas Pruitt understood at least as clearly as she did, and considerably more usefully to himself. Her daughter's name was Tahia, 7 years old, and already old enough to walk without complaint for hours through snow that came past her knees, because her mother had taught her, gently and without cruelty, that complaining cost strength a person could not spare. Her son was Nantan, 5, small enough still to ride his mother's hip when his own legs gave out, which they had done twice already that morning. Sitala had chosen his name herself over Kaywin's quiet objection that it was too large a name for a small boy, a word that meant one who leads, because she had looked at her infant son the winter he was born and decided, with a mother's stubborn hope, that the world needed exactly that kind of man from him eventually, whatever it cost to raise one. Iron Creek did not want them, and it did not pretend otherwise. The boarding house turned Sitala away at the door before she had finished asking, the proprietress's eyes sliding to the 2 children behind her with an expression Sitala had learned over 3 hard years of dealing with towns like this one, not to waste her remaining strength reacting to. The church, when she tried it next, was locked against the storm and against her both, the Reverend nowhere in sight, though smoke rose plainly from his own chimney around back. Men on the boardwalk who might have spared a dying dog a second look walked past a freezing Apache woman and her 2 children without breaking stride, and one, a broad-shouldered ranch hand in a good wool coat, one of Pruitt's, laughed to his companion, loud enough to carry, that the town's Indian problem appeared to be solving itself for free this winter. And wasn't that a mercy on the county's purse? Sitala heard every word of it in English. She had learned specifically so that men like him could never again pretend she hadn't understood. The cold by then had stopped being a weather condition and had become something closer to a second set of hands pressing in from every direction at once, and Sitala had learned, over 3 winters of hard travel, exactly how a body surrendered to it, first the fingers, then the feeling in the feet, then a dangerous, treacherous warmth that felt almost like comfort right before it killed a person outright, which was the stage she could see beginning to creep into Nantan's slowing blink. She had buried a husband already to men who mistook a river and a rancher's greed for acts of God, and she was not going to bury 2 children to a town's simple unwillingness to open a door. And so she did the only thing left to a woman with no more doors to knock on. Gathered both children into what little warmth her own body still held, and made herself as small and as patient a target for whatever mercy the morning might still produce as 3 years of disappointment had taught her how to be. What Sitala did not see, because she had no reason yet to be watching for it, was the man in the black coat, standing beneath the awning of the land office across the street, unmoved by the cold in the particular way of a man who has never once had to worry about it. Horace Dabney was the territory's Indian agent, a position that paid him modestly on paper, and considerably more in practice through arrangements he had made with men like Silas Pruitt, who found it useful to have federal authority quietly available whenever Apache families sat on land or water a rancher wanted cleared. Dabney had been watching the scattering of Kewin's old band for months with the patient interest of a man cataloging loose ends, and the sight of a widow with 2 children walking unescorted and without an agency pass straight into the middle of Iron Creek was to him not a tragedy in need of mercy, but a piece of paperwork nearly ready to be filed. He made no move that morning. He simply watched and remembered her face and turned back into the warmth of the land office to finish the conversation he had been having with Pruitt before the widow's arrival had interrupted it. A conversation about a canyon of good water and how conveniently empty of legitimate Apache claim it would look once its last widow was no longer standing on it to contest anything. Dabney had come to the territory 8 years earlier, a genuinely idealistic man, or so he still believed on the rare nights his conscience troubled him enough to require believing it. Sent west with instructions to see federal ration policy carried out fairly among bands the government had already broken most of its earlier promises to. Idealism, in Dabney's case, had not survived contact with a salary too small to live comfortably on in a territory where every rancher with an appetite for Apache land had cashed a spare for an agent willing to look the other way. Pruitt had been the first to make the arrangement explicit, 3 winters back, over a bottle of good whiskey Dabney could not otherwise have afforded, and it had grown from there the way such arrangements always did. A ration count quietly underreported here, a grazing dispute resolved in a rancher's favor there, until Dabney had stopped thinking of himself as a corrupt man and started thinking of himself in the comfortable manner of men who do this successfully for years, as merely a practical one operating in an impractical country. Sitala's small, scattered band and the water Pruitt wanted under it represented simply the next practical matter on a long list Dabney had stopped losing sleep over sometime around his 4th year in the position. Amos came out of the bank with Pruitt's answer already written plain on his own face. No extension. The note due in full by spring or the ranch went to auction, and nearly walked straight past the 3 of them huddled in the lee of the mercantile's porch before something made him stop. It was not, he would tell people honestly for years afterward, whenever the subject came up, some grand vision of justice. It was smaller and more immediate than that. It was the boy's bare hands, red going toward white, and the way the little girl had wrapped both her own hands around her brother's to share what little warmth either of them had left, and the mother's face, which held no plea in it at all. Only the flat, exhausted arithmetic of a woman calculating exactly how many more minutes her children had before the cold stopped being uncomfortable and started being fatal. He crouched down in front of them, which put him below the eye level of most of the men who'd walked past without stopping, and learned the boy's name first, because he had learned somewhere that starting with a child took the fear out of a mother's eyes faster than any promise aimed at her directly could. Nanton gave his name back in a voice steadier than his shivering had any right to allow. Teha watched Amos with the frank, unblinking suspicion of a 7-year-old who has already learned that kind adults are sometimes the most dangerous kind, and Sitala watched him too, saying nothing yet, waiting to see what shape his kindness would take. "You've got a long way left to go in this." Amos kept his voice low, meaning the storm and meaning considerably more than the storm. Her husband's remaining kin, by her own reckoning, were camped 9 miles south, if she could reach them before dark. 9 miles on foot, in that wind, with a child who could no longer feel his own feet, was a sentence Amos understood immediately as a death sentence, dressed up as a plan, and he made that plain without softening it, because he judged correctly. He thought about Duke standing in that leaking lean-to the whole ride back, into being aware of himself, and he thought about it while he was still crouched on the mercantile porch, too, turning the arithmetic of his own ruin over, and finding, to his own faint surprise, that it came out simpler than he expected. A man about to lose a 400-acre ranch to a banknote by spring gained nothing durable by keeping one horse through to March. A woman and 2 children standing in a blizzard 9 miles from the nearest safety gained, potentially, everything. He did not deliberate over it the way a man deliberates over a decision he suspects he'll regret. He simply stood, walked the 2 blocks to where Duke was hitched outside the bank, and led the gelding back. The scene of it, a broke rancher pressing his own reins into an Apache widow's hands on the open street, in front of God and Iron Creek, and Silas Pruitt's men still laughing on the boardwalk, took less than a minute, and it emptied Amos Colter of the last asset that stood between his ranch and total collapse. And every soul who witnessed it understood exactly what he had thrown away and exactly how little sense it made. Sitala did not thank him extravagantly. She looked at him for a long moment, the same searching calculation she'd been running on every stranger for 3 hard years, and allowed only that she would remember what he had done longer than he would like her to, which struck Amos at the time as a strange thing for a woman to say to a man giving her a horse, and which he understood, much later, as something closer to a promise than a thank you. He remembered, for the rest of his life, the particular details of that handoff more clearly than he remembered almost anything else from that entire ruinous winter. The way Duke's breath came out in 2 thick plumes of steam against the falling snow, the animal shifting uneasily at a stranger's unfamiliar scent, the raw, wine-cracked feel of Sitala's fingers closing around the leather where his own had just been, cold enough that he felt it even through his gloves, the small sound Teja made, not quite a word when she understood the horse now belonged, at least for that day, to her family and not to the stranger who had been crouching in front of them a moment before. He had given away plenty in the 3 ruinous years since his father's death, pride mostly, in every begging conversation with a bank clerk, but he had never before felt an act of giving land in his own chest the way this one did, a physical lightness where he expected only loss. He walked the 9 miles home himself, on foot, in the same storm, arriving well past dark with his hands too cold to properly work the latch on his own barn door, and he reminded himself the whole way that he had done the only decent thing available, and that decency did not require a man to feel good about the cost of it. By morning, the story had already made its way around Iron Creek in the particular gleeful, appalled way bad decisions travel through small towns, and Amos Colter had earned himself a new name to go with the old one. No longer merely the broke Colter boy circling the drain, but the fool who'd given his last horse to an Indian woman rather than keep it through the winter. That would break him for good. Sitala did not reach her husband's kin that night after all. Duke carried the 3 of them only as far as an abandoned line shack, 2 miles shy of her destination before the horse itself, spent from a full day's ride into headwind, could go no farther without rest, and it was there, huddled against Nantan and Teja in a shack with a roof half fallen in, back at Amos Colter's own gate. Her husband's remaining kin, she now understood clearly from a passing trapper who'd stopped to share his fire the next morning, had themselves been driven farther south by the same hard winter and the same agent's tightening grip on ration counts. Scattered into groups too small and too scared to shelter a widow and 2 more mouths through what remained of the season. There was in the whole white man's stretch of that territory exactly one door that had opened to her without calculation attached to it, and it belonged to the ruined rancher who could least afford to have opened it. She walked Duke back north over 2 days, rationing what little food the trapper had spared, and arrived at Amos's gate on the 3rd morning, looking, he would say later, like a woman who had decided something, and was not interested in discussing the decision, only in whether he intended to honor the shelter his gift implied. He did not hesitate the way a more careful man might have, weighing what the town would say about a bachelor rancher housing an Apache widow and her children under his own roof through a whole winter. He simply opened the barn to Duke and the house to the rest of them, and set about the practical business of making a cold house feed and warm 4 people instead of 1, which was harder than the gesture on the street had been, and which he did not for one moment regret either. The first days were awkward in the particular way that honest arrangements between strangers usually are, neither of them entirely sure what shape their new household was meant to take. Amos gave up his own parents' old bedroom to Sitala and the children, without waiting to be prompted, and moved his bedroll to the front room by the fire, a decision he made so plainly and so quickly that Sitala found herself, against her own caution, unable to locate the string she kept expecting to find attached to it. Taya spent the first 2 days saying almost nothing at all, watching the house and its owner with the same careful assessment she brought to every new stranger, while Nantan, recovering faster, the way small children often did, had claimed the barn as his personal territory by the 3rd morning and had to be retrieved twice from arguments with a disgruntled hen. Sitala kept her own counsel through those first days, cooking what she could from what the house held, tending the children, watching Amos for the tell she was certain would eventually show itself, the moment his kindness turned to expectation, the way she had seen happen in other households, other towns, other men. It did not come that week or the next. If Sitala's courage is holding you the way it's holding this whole valley, hit join beside the channel name and become a channel member before the story goes on. The winter that followed taught Amos more about survival than 3 decades on that ranch had managed to teach him alone. Sitala knew things his own hardscrabble upbringing had never covered: which bark to strip and boil for a fever, how to read a coming storm 2 full days out from the particular stillness of the air and the behavior of the ranch's remaining chickens, how to stretch a single rabbit across 4 meals without any one of them tasting thin. She rebuilt, in the first week alone, a shelf of dried plants Amos hadn't known his own root cellar could support, working alongside her own careful accounting of every jar and every day of food left, because a widow who has watched her people go hungry under a bad agent's rationing does not trust plenty even when it's finally sitting in front of her. Tia took to following Amos on his morning chores with a seriousness well past her years, learning the names of his few remaining animals and asking questions he found himself answering as honestly as he'd have addressed an adult. In Nantan, once the cold had properly left his small body, turned out to possess an unstoppable curiosity about every tool in the barn, and Amos caught himself, more than once, smiling at things that had stopped being funny to him somewhere around the year his mother died. The worst storm of that whole winter came in late January, a 2-day whiteout that buried the lean-to's remaining livestock, 3 milk cows and a handful of scrawny yearlings. Amos had somehow kept through the drought, under drifts deep enough to seal them away from water entirely, and it was Sitala, not Amos, who noticed on the second morning that the cattle's usual restless bawling had gone silent in a way that meant trouble rather than comfort. She led Amos out into wind that stung like grit thrown from a fist, reading the drift patterns against the barn wall with a certainty he had no framework to argue with, and found the herd exactly where she predicted they'd be, packed together against the leeward fence line with ice already crusting their muzzles shut. Between the 2 of them, they broke the ice free by hand, chopped a path to water Amos hadn't known existed under that much snow, and saved every animal he owned by the time the storm broke on the 3rd day. Amos stood afterward in the ruined shelter of his own barn, hands raw and bleeding from the work, and acknowledged to her plainly that she had just saved the last thing of value he had left in the world, and Sitala answered only that a man who gave away his last horse to a stranger had earned the right to keep whatever few cattle remained, which was as close as she had yet come to telling him she had begun, despite every careful instinct, to care whether he kept them. Sitala watched all of this with the same wariness she brought to everything, because 3 years of broken white promises had taught her that kindness given easily was often kindness with strings attached, and she had no intention of discovering the strings the hard way with her children's safety on the line. But watching Amos through that first month, watching him go without meat himself so the children could have it, watching him ride out in weather he had no business riding in to check that her husband's remaining kin hadn't been located after all. Watching him say nothing at all when townsfolk who came by for supplies looked twice at the sight of an Apache woman drawing water at his, well, she began slowly, and against her own better judgment, to file him under a different heading than the rest. There was an evening some 3 weeks into that arrangement, when the fire had burned low, and the children were long asleep, and Amos and Sitala sat on opposite sides of the hearth in the particular silence of two people who have run out of practical things to discuss. He finally raised the subject of Kewin, not out of idle curiosity, but because he had come to understand that grief unspoken curdles into something worse, and he suspected she had been carrying hers alone for 11 months without once setting it down in front of another living soul. She described the flood and the canyon and the particular cruelty of watching a strong man drown trying to save animals that a rancher 40 miles away wanted for his own grazing anyway. She did not cry telling it. Amos registered that and understood it not as coldness, but as a woman who had long ago decided that crying in front of people who might use the sight against her was a luxury she could not spend. When she finished, he managed only that he was sorry, plainly, without reaching for her, without trying to fix what could not be fixed, and it was that restraint, the not reaching, the not fixing, that did more to earn her trust than any grander gesture could have managed. Iron Creek, through those same weeks, had not stopped talking, and the talk had begun turning from mockery into something with a harder edge to it. Silas Pruitt himself cornered Amos outside the bank one February afternoon, all easy smiles and no warmth behind them, and mentioned, in the mild tone of a man discussing weather, that folks were saying peculiar things about the Colter place these days, an Apache woman kept under a bachelor's roof all winter. And wasn't Amos concerned what that arrangement might do to a man's standing, with the bank holding his note come spring? Amos returned only that his standing with the bank had never once depended on Pruitt's approval of his household, and Pruitt had laughed easily and allowed he supposed that was true for now, before riding off in a way that left the threat hanging in the cold air considerably longer than the man himself did. Amos did not mention the conversation to Sitala that evening, telling himself it was nothing worth troubling her with, though he registered riding home, that Pruitt had known exactly how many people were living under his roof, and exactly how long they had been there. A level of detail that suggested considerably more attention paid to the Colter place than idle town gossip alone could explain. What neither of them yet knew, sitting in that quiet firelit room building something neither was ready to name, was that Horace Dabney had spent that same 3 weeks doing considerably less patient work. He had confirmed, through a clerk at the land office who owed Silas Pruitt a favor, that Kewin's old canyon claim had never been formally recorded under territorial law, which made it, in the particular legal fiction Dabney intended to construct, unclaimed land available for a rancher's grazing lease the moment its last Apache widow stopped standing on it. He had also confirmed that Sitala herself carried no current agency pass, unsurprising, since she had left a scattering, starving band rather than a functioning reservation, but a technicality Dabney intended to use exactly as a technicality is meant to be used against a person with no lawyer. By the time the first thaw softened the road enough for a wagon, Dabney had a vagrancy order drafted, citing an Apache woman found off reservation without a valid pass, harboring at the residence of a white rancher under circumstances the order described, with the bureaucrat's careful cruelty as morally irregular and requiring immediate agency intervention. Sitala had not needed a draft order in hand to know, in the private hours before dawn when sleep would not come, exactly what shape a threat like this eventually took, because she had sat with other Apache mothers over the years who had lived the aftermath of it rather than merely feared it. Women who described children returned from distant schools, speaking only clipped English, flinching from their own mother tongue, as though it were a wound reopening, hair cut short in a style that marked them as neither fully one people nor the other for the rest of their lives. She had heard of runaways who never made it home, of letters that stopped arriving, of a grief with no funeral to mark it because the child in question was still, technically, alive somewhere else, alive and unreachable and slowly becoming a stranger by federal design. She confided none of this to Teja or Nantan directly in those cold pre-dawn hours, keeping her fear the way she kept most things, folded small and carried privately, but it was that specific dread, sharper and more patient than any blizzard, that she was already steeling herself against on the gray March morning when Dabney's men finally rode up the frozen road to Amos's gate. The order arrived at Amos's gate on a gray morning in early March, carried by two of Pruitt's hired men riding escort for Dabney himself, and it named, specifically, the removal of Sitala to the San Carlos Agency for processing and the separation of both children to a boarding school 300 miles distant, an institution that would cut their hair, forbid their language, and rename them for the convenience of instructors who had never once wondered what either child preferred to be called. Sitala heard the words boarding school and understood faster and more completely than Amos did in that first frozen moment exactly what kind of death this was. Not the fast kind the blizzard had threatened back in December, but the slow bureaucratic kind that took children alive and returned them as strangers to their own mothers. She put herself, without discussion, physically between Dabney's men and the doorway where Teja and Nantan stood, and made herself understood, in English clear enough that no man present could later claim confusion about her meaning, that her children were not agency property, and neither, whatever paper Dabney carried, was she. Dabney, for his part, seemed almost bored by the whole confrontation, a man accustomed to paperwork accomplishing what argument could not, and he informed her, through Amos, addressing the rancher rather than the widow, as though she were furniture in her own defense, that she had 3 days to present a valid pass, after which the order would be executed by whatever force proved necessary, and that any white man sheltering her past that deadline would find himself charged with obstruction of federal Indian policy, a charge Dabney mentioned, almost pleasantly. That a man already 3 payments behind on Silas Pruitt's banknote might find difficult to survive both financially and otherwise. Before we ride into what those 3 days cost everyone in this story, understand this much first. Dabney had badly misjudged exactly how alone he assumed this widow actually was. Amos wanted, in the hour after Dabney's men rode off, to do the obvious foolish thing, ride to Iron Creek and confront Pruitt directly, or bar every door in the house and dare federal men to break them down, and it was Sitala who stopped him, with a hand on his arm and a steadiness in her voice that surprised him even after 3 months of watching how little rattled her. Fighting Dabney's men with fists and a locked door bought them days, she reminded him, not a future, and a widow who had already lost one strong man to another rancher's ambitions did not intend to lose the second one to the same reckless bravery. What she needed from him, she allowed, was patience, and what she needed from herself was to stop hiding and start being seen, because a woman the whole territory believed had vanished quietly into the winter was a woman Dabney could erase without consequence, and a woman standing in broad daylight with witnesses. She sent Nantan's older cousin, a boy of 14, from a nearby band who'd been trading dried meat at the ranch that same week, south before dawn the next morning, carrying word, not of surrender, but of gathering, to whatever remained of Kewin's scattered kin, and to a man named Tazin, her late husband's uncle, and the closest thing the fractured band still had to an elder whose word carried weight. It was not, Sitala was careful to explain to Amos that night, a plea for rescue, in the way he might have imagined it. It was a summons to witness, because Apache law and white law agreed on at least one point that winter. A false claim survives longest in an empty room, and Sitala intended to make sure Dabney's vagrancy order was never allowed the privacy it needed to succeed. She sent a second rider that same morning, a girl of 12, entrusted with a folded note in Amos's own hand, north to Fort Craig and Captain Cyrus Boone, whom Sitala had met once, briefly and unhappily, the year Kewin drowned. when Boone had been the one federal officer willing to write down her account of Pruitt's grazing claim without dismissing it outright. Boone owed neither Pruitt nor Dabney any particular loyalty, having crossed paths with both men before in matters that left him with a low opinion of the agency's bookkeeping, and Sitala judged, correctly, that an officer already inclined toward suspicion needed only the right morning to act on it. She did not tell Amos she expected Boone to arrive in time to matter. She reminded him only that a fair man forewarned was worth considerably more than a fair man surprised, and that she intended to give the coming confrontation every possible witness she could summon, military and civilian and kin alike, because a widow with no standing of her own had learned to make standing out of numbers instead. Amos, for his own part, rode the opposite direction, into Iron Creek itself, not to beg Pruitt for anything but to find Hiram Voss, the mercantile owner who had sold Amos feed on credit for 2 lean years, and who had, Amos suspected correctly, kept better books on Silas Pruitt's land office dealings than Pruitt himself realized. Voss did not love Pruitt, whose bank had squeezed half the honest ranchers in the valley at one time or another, and when Amos inquired plainly whether he'd ever seen paperwork on a canyon claim near Kewin's old grazing ground, Voss admitted after some hesitation that he had handled the filing for Pruitt the previous autumn, attempting to register that exact water source as an unclaimed grazing lease, filed, notably, only weeks after Kewin's drowning, a timing Voss himself had found uncomfortable enough to remember clearly. The 3 days Dabney had allotted passed with a slowness that felt to everyone waiting them out, considerably longer than the whole winter that preceded them. Sitala spent them teaching Tehya and Nantan, in quiet, unhurried sessions by the fire, both English words and words in their own tongue, telling them plainly that whatever happened in the coming days, they were to remember exactly who they were and exactly whose children they remained, because an agency school could cut hair and forbid language but could not. She vowed to them fiercely reach inside and take the knowing itself if they held on to it hard enough. Amos, watching this from across the room some evenings, understood he was witnessing something he had no framework in his own life to fully measure, a mother arming her children against an enemy that wore government paper instead of a rifle, and it was in watching her do this calm and relentless that whatever careful affection had been building between them through the winter tipped over quietly and without ceremony into something neither of them had words ready for yet. On the second of those 3 evenings, Sitala told the children the story of changing woman, the way her own mother had passed it to her by a different fire in a different, gentler year, how the world had been remade through a woman's endurance rather than a warrior's conquest, how the people had survived every hard winter before this one, precisely because the women among them refused to let hardship erase what they knew of themselves. Tehya listened with the fierce attention of a girl memorizing something she already sensed she would need later, and Nantan, though still young enough to drift toward sleep partway through, caught enough of it to ask, half dreaming, whether his mother was like changing woman, to which Sitala allowed only that every mother tried to be in her own smaller way, and that trying was most of what the story had ever asked of anyone. Amos, listening from across the room without pretending not to, understood that he was being shown. Deliberately, a piece of Sitala's world she had kept guarded through the whole long winter, and understood it as its own kind of trust, a woman who had learned to hold everything close, finally opening one door of many. On the one night she most needed her children to remember which floor they were standing on. On the morning of the 3rd day Dabney returned, and this time he brought more than 2 hired men. He brought 6, along with a deputized town constable, persuaded by Pruitt's money that the law required his presence, and he brought, riding a little apart from the rest, with the discomfort of a man who suspects he's about to witness something he'll regret, Reverend Aldous Pratt, summoned by Dabney specifically because a churchman's presence, he calculated, would lend his removal order a moral cover it did not remotely deserve. What Dabney had not calculated on, and what changed the shape of that whole gray morning, was the dozen riders already waiting at Amos's gate when his party arrived, Tarzan at their head, along with 6 of Caewin's remaining kin, and more unsettling to Dabney than he wanted to show, 3 older women of the band who had ridden the whole way, specifically to stand as witnesses, because Apache custom held that certain truths required the presence of the community's grandmothers to be properly heard. Tarzan did not raise a weapon and did not need to. He simply sat his horse at the gate and informed Dabney in Apache first and then in blunt, unhesitating English, for the benefit of the constable and the reverend both, that the canyon Dabney's order rested on had been watered by Caewin's family for 3 generations before any territorial survey existed to dispute it. Agency pass or no agency pass represented an inherited right no federal clerk's paperwork could erase by simply declining to acknowledge it. The 3 grandmothers who had ridden with Tarzan dismounted without a word and arranged themselves in a slow, deliberate line along the porch rail, close enough to Teha and Nanton that both children moved instinctively nearer to them, and their presence did more to steady the yard than any single argument raised that morning. Done hurried authority that no amount of Dabney's paperwork had a category for. One of them, the eldest, fixed Dabney with a look that carried no fear in it at all, only the patient contempt of a woman who had outlived 3 agents exactly like him and gave nothing whatsoever, which Amos noticed unsettled Dabney's hired men considerably more than shouting would have. The whole yard held that way for a long moment, riders on one side, kine and grandmothers, and a widow on the other, snow melt dripping steadily off the barn roof into the sudden thick silence before Sitala stepped forward into the space between them. Sitala herself came out onto the porch, then Tea's hand in hers and Nantan close against her side, and she did not hide behind Amos or behind Tarzan either, though both men would gladly have stood in front of her. She addressed Dabney directly, in the clear, unhurried English she had learned precisely so that men like him could never again claim not to have understood her, and she made clear that she had not run from his order and did not intend to start now, that her children would answer to their own names for the whole of their lives, regardless of what any distant school intended for them, and that if Dabney meant to take them, he would do it in front of every witness, now standing in that yard, white and Apache both, so that whatever account he gave afterward about the reasons for it would have to survive being told in front of the very people who'd watched what actually happened. Reverend Pratt, who had come along expecting to bless a routine and unpleasant piece of federal business, found himself instead standing in a yard full of grandmothers and kinsmen, and a widow who addressed a federal agent with more composure than the agent himself currently possessed, and something in him. Call it conscience, finally locating an inconvenient morning to arrive on. Refused to lend the scene the cover Dabney had brought him for. He made clear plainly enough for the whole yard to hear that he could not in good faith bless the separation of 2 small children from a mother standing in front of him in full possession of her senses and her rights, whatever paper claimed otherwise, and that he intended to write to the territorial governor's office that same week, describing exactly what he had witnessed. It was Hiram Voss, arriving late, with a satchel of ledger pages under one arm, who delivered the blow Dabney had least anticipated. He produced, in front of the assembled yard, the filing he had handled the previous autumn, Pruitt's own attempt to register Caewin's Canyon as unclaimed grazing land, dated weeks after the drowning that had conveniently emptied it of its strongest claimant. Timed in a way that made the whole arrangement between agent and cattleman considerably harder to dismiss as coincidence. A federal agent moving to remove an Apache widow from disputed water her family had held for generations, acting on behalf of the one rancher who stood to gain everything from her removal, was not the tidy vagrancy matter Dabney had spent weeks constructing. It was, in front of witnesses now, including a reverend, prepared to write to the governor the shape of exactly the corruption it actually was. Dabney's composure did not survive the yard intact. He blustered about federal authority and the legal weight of his order, and the constable, whose own nerve had been thinner than Pruitt's money implied, found sudden and urgent business back in Iron Creek, rather than continue standing in a yard full of witnesses to a fraud he had unwittingly helped enforce. Tazen, for his part, needed no further words, which somehow landed harder in that yard than any threat could have. The silence of a man who had made his point and saw no further need to spend words on it. It was Sitala who delivered the final word, telling Dabney plainly that he was welcome to ride to San Carlos and to the territorial governor both, and that she and every witness in that yard would be there ahead of him with the same account, because she had spent 3 years learning exactly how little her word alone was worth to men like him, and had spent the last 3 days making certain it would never again have to stand alone. Dabney rode out that morning having accomplished nothing but the public unraveling of his own scheme, and within 2 weeks word had traveled from Reverend Pratt's letter and from an army officer at nearby Fort Craig. A Captain Cyrus Boone, with no particular love for Pruitt and considerably less patience for agents who used federal paper to settle a cattleman's land disputes, that Dabney's conduct was under formal review, a review that ended by early summer, with Dabney relieved of his post and quietly reassigned to a territory considerably less lucrative than the one he'd been running like a private fiefdom. Pruitt's claim on the canyon died with the scrutiny, no clerk in the territory willing any longer to touch a filing so publicly tied to a scandal, and the water that had killed Kewin remained, at last and for good, exactly what it had always been under any law worth respecting, his family's, and now his children's after him. Iron Creek's opinion of Amos Colter shifted more slowly than the legal case against Dabney did, but it shifted. The same men who had laughed at a fool giving away his last horse found themselves through that spring watching a rancher whose foolish gift had somehow returned to him tenfold, a woman whose knowledge of the land and whose people's goodwill toward the man who'd sheltered her turned out to be worth considerably more than one gelding ever had been. Tazen's band, grateful and no longer scattered, helped Amos rebuild his herd through the summer with animals traded fairly, rather than given out of pity, and Hiram Voss extended credit more generously to a rancher whose word had proven, in the one moment that mattered most. What grew between Amos and Sitala through that spring did not announce itself with any single dramatic moment, because both of them had already spent a hard winter learning that the truest things between two people are usually built in the ordinary hours rather than the extraordinary ones in shared work at the well. On and Tehaz questions met patiently at the supper table, in Nantan learning to sit a horse properly under Amos's careful instruction, in evenings by the fire that no longer needed to be filled with careful silence because the silence itself had become comfortable. It was Sitala in the end who finally voiced the thing. Neither had yet risked saying aloud, telling Amos one evening in early summer that she had buried one good man already and had not intended walking into Iron Creek that blizzard morning to ever again risk loving a second one, and that she had done it anyway. Slowly, and against every careful instinct, 3 hard years had taught her. Because a man who gave away his last horse to a stranger expected nothing of her in return, not even gratitude, and a heart that had been guarding itself that fiercely could only hold out so long against a kindness. Amos asked her properly, a week later, standing at the same well, where she had drawn water under the town's disapproving eyes that first month, and he did it without a ring he could not yet afford, and without any of the polished words he suspected other men used, saying only that he had nothing left to give her, that she had not already given herself back tenfold, and that he was asking anyway, because a life spent working alongside her felt like the first thing in 3 ruinous years that made any sense at all. Sitala did not answer immediately, weighing the question the way she weighed everything of consequence, and allowed finally that she would marry him on one condition, that Teha and Nantan would grow up knowing both their mother's people and their stepfather's without ever being made to choose between the two. To a condition Amos agreed to before she had finished stating it, because he had already watched all winter exactly what it cost a child to lose half of who they were, They married that autumn in a ceremony that honored both of their peoples without asking either to disappear into the other, Reverend Pratt speaking the words the territory required, and Tajan speaking the words Kewin's memory deserved, and Tehya and Nanton standing between the two ceremonies as though they had always understood, better than either adult, that a family could be built from two different rivers meeting without either one losing its own name. Sitala did not stop being Chiricahua Apache the day she became Amos Colter's wife, any more than Amos stopped being the rancher his father had raised him to be, and the home they built together over the following years held both truths comfortably. Tazin's kin welcome at the table as often as Voss and the Reverend both. The canyon that had cost Kewin his life, now watering a combined herd that fed two families, instead of dividing one. Years later, travelers passing through that stretch of the territory would sometimes remark on the Colter Ranch as a curiosity worth mentioning at the next town, over a spread where Apache riders came and went as freely as any hired hand, where a rancher's wife was as likely to be found doctoring a sick calf with dried bark, where the two oldest children went easily by names in two languages and seemed embarrassed by neither. Tazin visited every spring for the rest of his life, teaching Nantan to track and to sit a horse the old way alongside whatever Amos taught him of ledgers and fence lines, and the grandmothers who had stood that gray morning at Amos's gate returned often enough over the years that Tehya came to think of their visits as reliable as first frost. Sitala kept all her life a small worn place on her right hand where Duke's cold reins had bitten into her frozen fingers that first blizzard morning, and she would tell Tehya, whenever the girl wondered about the mark, that it was the first thing a stranger had ever given her for free, and that she had spent every year since making sure it turned out to have been worth what it cost him. She had grew into the kind of young woman Iron Creek eventually learned to respect rather than pity, fluent in both her mother's language and her stepfather's ledger books, and Nantan grew, as his mother had once stubbornly hoped over his father's gentle objection, into exactly the kind of man his name had promised, steady and looked to and unafraid. Amos never did replace Duke with any single horse he loved the same way, though the herd he and Sitala built together over the following decade would eventually number in the hundreds, because he liked to say whenever anyone wondered that the best trade he ever made in his life cost him his last horse and paid him back a wife, 2 children, and a family that no banknote or bad agent ever again had the power to take from him. Before we let this fire burn down for the night, tap join beside the channel name and become a member. It's what keeps stories like theirs coming back to you.